Jeff Taylor is a political scientist who worked at RCTC with me, and we became friends and found out that we had a mutual admiration for Bob Dylan. Someone heard one of his presentations who worked for Palgrave Macmillan, which is the publisher of the book. They contacted Jeff and they said, would you like to write a book about Ronald Reagan? And he said, well, I'm kind of burned out. I just wrote a book. That was Politics on a Human Scale. And what I'd really like to do is write a book about Bob Dylan and politics. And I've got a friend I'd like to write it with. And so Jeff called me up and said, well, I've got this idea, and would you be interested? And before he could finish the sentence, I said, yeah. Write a book about Bob Dylan, yeah.
In the basement, mixing up the medicine. I'm on the pavement, thinking about the government.
We started talking about Bob Dylan and politics because it's surprisingly an area that is not well covered. Obviously, Dylan and poetry and, just your run-of-the-mill biography of Dylan, there are tons of those out there. But sort of definitive overview of where Dylan fits into American post-war political tradition, it's really not been done. Jeff is a political scientist, I'm a historian, and so as it sort of panned out then, I got the chapters dealing with Dylan's background, his 60s era, and then I also took on a chapter which is sort of around the concept of freedom. Dylan's roots, essentially, and then sort of Dylan as voice of a generation, and what does that mean, and then freedom. And Jeff focuses on mostly Dylan's post-conversion, and if you're not familiar with Dylan, he converted to Christianity in the late 1970s. And so one of Jeff's points in the book is that Dylan can be understood as a Christian anarchist. And we use the theme of anarchy throughout the book. Not so much, Dylan smashing windows of Starbucks, yelling down with the state, but the idea of a general resistance to structures of power, advocacy of freedom, that sort of thing. So, sort of in the classic sense of anarchy, in the most general sense of anarchy. So that's sort of the idea around the book. So some of the things that I do, for example, as I go through the Minnesota political tradition, and I talk about the Iron Range and what the political atmosphere of the Iron Range is, and I talk about the radicalism that existed up there, and then I connect Dylan's work to some of these ideas. As private as Dylan is, there were times in the process where, I felt kind of, bad, digging around. But it's not a biography, we're not trying to uncover, well, in 1987 he was dating this person. It's not like that at all. It's just saying, this is a very important artist. Bottom line, this is the most influential songwriter in American history. Maybe a few people might debate that. If he's not the most, he's one of the most, but he's certainly the most influential songwriter in the rock and roll era. No ifs, ands, or buts.
When I paint my masterpiece,
If I were on the desert island, right, and every day I had to get rid of a Dylan album, what would the last one be? Probably Highway 61 Revisited.
You next me up. How does it feel? How does it feel to be without a home? Like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone.
I was really trying to dig in to the Minnesota political tradition and sort of the culture of the Iron Range and saying, well, what traits do we see that would produce someone like Bob Dylan? And it's generally a populism, support of the little guy against, again, the financial powers that be, the political powers that be. You would go into like I said, chapter 2, Voice of a Generation. Most people just assume Bob Dylan is nothing but, the Pied Piper for the hippies and the baby boomers, and we're saying no. It's much more complex than that. One of the things that I believe that really made Dylan successful is he allowed you to fill in your own blanks. His songs weren't so simple, and you could color in. He provided the dot to dots, and then you shaded in yourself, and people like that. To think that he fits neatly into any box, anybody that studied Dylan, that's one of the first conclusions you got to come to. It's really hard to label and define him. With that said, in some ways we do label and define him, but what we're really trying to do is create more of a cultural overview and say, all right, here's what he said, here's what he wrote and sang, and this is where it fits. Because the other thing is when you start to study Dylan, you will find contradictory statements, and he's the kind of guy who would say things to journalists and stuff just to throw them off the track. So you have to try to figure out, well, what's true, what isn't true, how many times has he said this, does that sound right, does that fit with other things? And so, it was connecting a lot of dots. And that was one of the concepts that we started with. I remember talking to Jeff on the phone very early in the process, and he was saying we need to make lots of connections, and so that's what we try to do. Like I said, if you ask us, at this point, we believe we've written the definitive political book.
Once upon a time, you dressed so fine, threw the bums a dime in your prime. Didn't you? People call and say, beware, dog, you're bound to fall. You thought they were wrong. Can you? You used to laugh about everybody that was hanging out.